I'm very excited and honored to introduce our speaker this afternoon, someone I consider to be a Franciscan rock star. Think Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, Annie Dillard, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and you'll understand what I mean when I say you're in for a treat this afternoon. There are two words that come to my mind when I think of Father Murray Bodo: Franciscan writer. I believe that both titles inform and illuminate the grace of the other. Father Bodo has the extraordinary gift of crafting poetry and prose in a manner that is deeply sacramental, highly entertaining, thought-provoking, and life-affirming. His mystical depth and humble demeanor reflect those simple yet powerful words within our Franciscan tradition: peace and all good. When you spend 5 minutes with him, you will recognize each and every one of these characteristics that are infused in a soul that he so graciously and creatively shares with us through his writing and his company. I've been reading Father Bodo's works for a few years, but actually only met him mere months ago. He sat next to me one afternoon last November in a chapel, and that began a very easy and funny conversation which has continued. I was someone he had just met, yet took the time to ask me about my life, my work, my experiences, as well as very generously and kindly offering resources and recommendations for my research and writing with very keen attention, interest, and warmth. It was the unique gift of his wonderful sense of humor, wisdom, and charisma that I continue to reflect upon and treasure. This is what you get when you meet Father Murray, whether it is in person or on the page: passionate interest, commitment, generosity, delicious wit, and an abiding, subtle, jubilant life reflecting the teachings of the Gospels, St. Francis, and St. Clare. Father Bodo's writings serve as personal opportunities to study the lives of Francis and Clare and the much-beloved city of Assisi, beyond but not precluding academic exploration. His contemplation and reflection on the lives and spirituality of these two extraordinary saints offer refreshing insight into the joyful fashion in which we are all called to work and live in this world. His corpus of writing is as integral to his vocation as is his commitment to the priesthood. The connecting threads of this rich tapestry of his life are St. Clare and St. Francis of Assisi. We are privileged to have him offer a window into his meditations with us this afternoon. Please give a warm welcome to Father Murray Bodo.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Rock star? I forgot my band. But I'm so happy to be with you this afternoon and to share some of my poetry with you and just to share time with you. I've spent a lot of years in academia. I was an academic for 36 years, and that's a long time, and I loved every bit of it. So I'm glad to be here with you just to talk about poetry, which I've been writing since I was about 14 years old. It's something that's very much a part of who I am. I used to think when I first started as a little boy that poetry was these little rhyming couplets. If you could write something and there was a rhyming word at the end and then could write another line and it rhymed, that was really great stuff. And I did a lot of that. But it took me a while to realize that you could write 3 lines and then 4 lines. And so I grew in poetry from the most humble beginnings as just a boy poet who loved words. And that's really what a poet is, someone who loves words. It's not about big ideas necessarily, grand schemes, but it is about words and their magic, what they can do in the right combinations. And for me, poetry is a sacrament of language. Under the appearance of words, of their sounds, their meanings, the words of a poem make present another reality that's hidden underneath. And it's inside the words themselves. Often it's a reality that cannot be seen or heard or tasted or touched or smelled, but it can register and be experienced in the soul through the power of the imagination. And the imagination using all of the tropes of the poetic tradition, like metaphor, allegory, symbol, myth, sound. In other words, poetry is the news from the soul of the poet to the soul of the listener or the reader. It comes from a place other than prose. Often it finds you before you find it. It's not often I'm not going after something in a poem. Something comes to me, an image or a line or a word, and I'm trying to see where it's going to take me, what is going to happen on the page. Often it comes from the unconscious. An image, an archetypal image might rise to the consciousness, and you find words in it and around it. It tells the truth, but as Emily Dickinson says, it tells its slant. It doesn't say things directly so often as indirectly. It's not like a Hallmark card that says, I love you. But the whole poem might say, I love you, but it's coming at its slant. And it can be much more powerful that way. It comes to us mysteriously sometimes, like an oracle or a riddle. It hints at things. It tells stories that sound like songs sometimes. Poetry slows you down. You can't read it the way you would the newspaper. You have to spend time with it. It costs something to read it. The tone and the feel of the images that linger in the memory is something that is very much a part of poetry. Sometimes your breath will catch on some word, a surprise word maybe, an image that's shilly-shallying, out of kilter, and it brings you into another understanding of something that you thought you knew. Often poetry will surprise you that you know something you didn't know you knew until you saw what you said on the page. So I'm going to share some of my own poetry then at this time we have together. And the first one is very much what we would call light verse. But light verse can at times make a point very strongly that is different from just coming out and directly saying something. We all think of St. Francis somehow associated with birds. Most people think of Francis as the saint who has presence in every city on bird baths. And so I kind of was playing with that, playing with the words around that and the image of that. And this one is called St. Francis and the Birds. Why has it taken so long to realize St. Francis was right? Over 50 years of preaching him. Yet I didn't preach to the birds, preach in my underwear, roll naked in the snow, the briar bushes, sing the canticle of the creatures to leaders making war on one another, killing their people. Today I have to start. At least preach to a bird. Lie in the brown winter grass. Stand in the cold. Praise our Mother Earth for holding God's seed till spring, when God's glory will shine in new birthing. While I'm at it, why not embrace my own leper? Who though? Someone ugly, pious, ecclesial? Who knows? Maybe it's myself who's the leper I need to embrace. Today I have to rescue a dog and a cat from the pound. The cat will be harder. Maybe 2 cats then and no dog. This is getting harder than I thought. Maybe I should go back to the birds. Otherwise, I might have died at age 45, blind, emaciated, bleeding with the wounds of Christ. Birds are safer. I'll stick with the birds. So that's something light, but it makes a point, doesn't it? And you'll remember something of it, the tone, the expression, something of the way it is said. Poetry also can deal with myths. And I was working once for, I forget why now, but I was working with the myth of Icarus, who was the son of Daedalus, who built the great labyrinth, and then he couldn't get out of it. He was a great architect, but he couldn't figure out how he and his son were trapped in there. So he decides to make wings for his son, and they were made of wax so that he could fly out of the labyrinth. And he does, and it's pretty cool. He's starting to fly, and it's kind of fun, in fact, and he's getting up there higher and higher, but he gets very ambitious then and goes so high that he gets close to the sun, and the sun melts the wings, and he crashes into the sea. And I was reading that in Assisi. And those of you who may have been to Assisi or want to go, it's built on the side of a mountain, on the side of Mount Subasio. And I thought Francis, as a young boy, it was like the mountain climber type. He wanted to get on top of the mountain and be king of the hill. He wanted to be a great knight. He wanted to go off to war and be famous and be known. And every time he tried, he was a very wealthy young man, as you know, so his father could buy him just about anything, war horses, armor, privilege. But every time he went, something happened. The first war he went to with the neighboring city of Perugia, he was taken prisoner halfway there at the little town of Ponte San Giovanni, put in prison for a year, came back afterwards with what we would call post-traumatic stress. After he felt a little better, and if you ever completely feel better from that sort of thing. He decided maybe going to war was what he had to do, go back and do it right this time. And this time he gets a day's journey beyond Assisi, and God comes to him in a vision and tells him to go back to Assisi. And there it will be shown him what he will do. And so he's kind of lost. He feels like a coward, I'm sure, because of the way the other people see him. But he does. He goes back and he starts, going to churches that were abandoned outside the city walls. And one day the crucifix speaks to him. Francis, as you can see, my house is falling into ruin. Go and repair it. He wants Francis to go and repair seemingly this house. But it was a much bigger charge, he finds out. But he does build a little church. And one day he also has an experience of meeting a leper. And he goes up and not only gives coins to the leper, but he embraces him, and something happens to him, and he realizes that he has embraced Christ, that this is where he is to live. And the lepers lived below the city, down outside the walls in what at that time was a swamp. And so Francis, who wanted to be way up on the top of the mountain, finds himself down here in the swamp. And he finds that that's where God really is. And that's the way it is with us sometimes. We, especially if we're really keen on spirituality, if we push the spiritual life too far, we get disattached from the earth, from the world. And we're trying to find God way up here, and God's coming down, and we keep missing him. So that the real incarnational life is the life of the Spirit, infleshed in matter, in human beings. And so that was the image that I used for this it was a long introduction to the image in this poem of Icarus in Assisi. I think everything in the poem otherwise is clear. And I have a little quotation at the beginning. Icarus, son of Daedalus, to escape the labyrinth flies with wings made of wax, but he falls into the sea and drowns when his wings melt from flying too close to the sun. I feel you floating down, descending from Subassio's crest, like Icarus into his waiting sea. But you fall towards lepers' open arms, wolves' hungry jaws. With them you laugh at the heights you fell from. Your descent is ascent to love, who fell into the Virgin Mary's womb. Like Christ's, your coming down, coming, rises heavenward. Poverty is not without wings. It lifts, and we who live below rise by going further down with him who fell, that we might fly with poor, bruised hands and feet. We soar in lepers' skins. We praise from wolves and beggars' mouths. Francis, when he took on a new life, renounced his father in the piazza, the cortile of the bishop's court. And that must have been a terrible thing for Francis and his mother standing there. And Francis renouncing his father, who was a cloth merchant. He takes off all his clothes and lays them at the feet of his father and says, I will no longer say Pietro Bernardone, who was his father, but our Father who art in heaven. And I thought about that a long time before a poem started coming to me about how Pietro must have felt. We all always think of Francis, the great saint, the one who did become one of the most famous saints in the world in history, and his father receded into the shadows. But Francis shamed him in public, and what that must have felt like to him. So it's in the voice of his father, and it's in 3 parts. It's called The Cloth Merchant's Lament. Then laying his clothes at my feet, he walks away, just like that. The sun dyeing the evening sky, as we lift eyes to watch Francesco disappear from sight. He does not descend to the valley, but stops halfway at San Damiano, and that's the end of it. My son, my pride, outside the walls, trades between the Christ of San Damiano and the lepers of St. Mary of the Angels. Threadbare, he rebuilds ruined churches, shuns the cloth trade for stone. Part 2. I will no longer say, Father Pietro Bernardone, but our Father who art in heaven. A vicious slap in the face, which I will never forgive. Not that Francesco would stoop to beg my forgiveness. After all, what has God's Son to do with a hard-working cloth merchant who, like St. Joseph, only tried to teach his adopted son? God's curse on such ingratitude. And when my flesh has finally putrefied, may my skull turn to powder, lest Francesco fashion it to flush his guilt like rain from the church's leaden gutters. Part 3. Lady Pica, my sometime wife, goes out to the olive trees now that her darling Francesco's gone. She sits like stone, except for her moving hands sewing mad patterns into cloth. Her flesh sags with fasting. Her crazy son preaches love. Frayed cloth, flawed stone, the house of Bernardones undone. At the end of that poem, just a technical thing, is an I rhyme, stone undone. It looks like they rhyme, but only to the eye because they have a different sound. So there are rhymes that you hear and there's rhymes that you see, and they're called an I rhyme. For whatever that's worth. It's a little technical thing. It took me much, much longer to see Francis's mother, what she must have felt like there, the silent one, the one who's witnessing all this. I couldn't write about her because I couldn't see her. I couldn't, an image wouldn't come that would gel for me. Something about her. So one night I was reading very late at night, a couple years ago, a poet in England, Anne Beresford, who's a very fine poet, friend of mine, and I had her collected works. She's in her 80s now, and I just loved the book, but there was something in one of the poems that triggered something in me. And about midnight, a line came to me, and I sat up, and wrote it down. And then because I didn't want to lose it, I always have a little pad and a pencil there. Pencil, because it won't stop writing the way a pen will, upside down in the middle of the night. And I wanted to make sure I got it down. And I lay down again, and then another line came to me. So I got up and wrote that down, laid down again. Another line, so I said, this is kind of crazy, I better get up here, because it looks like this is going to happen. And this is one of those poems that every poet kneels down and gives thanks for, that comes all in a rush. And you have just a little work to do afterwards. Usually you work and work and work to get the poem right. But there are some times when a poem is a gift, a blessing. And this poem was it. And I changed very few things after I worked on it. There are a couple things you might need to know. A palfrey is a horse that women would ride in the Middle Ages. The war horse is a great big beast, like, the Budweiser, Clydesdales. They're big, they're a war machine. They can kill without anyone on them. And so that's the word in here, palfrey. And sometime on the windows, the people would have oiled parchment. They didn't have glass, but oil parchment. And so that's in here. It's called Lady Pica. Lady Pica was Francis's mother. Francis, dear one, the empty rooms cry out for you, and under the chimney's hood, the hearth fire burns untended. I sit in an upright chair. It is months now. Your father fusses with palfreys and war horses, while I shun linens and wool dresses trimmed and lined with fur. And no one sees. I sit by the window. I hear rumors. I stay inside. I sit in an upright chair. There is no song here, except for the birds I hear through the window's oiled parchment. The days are long. Your father roars at the dogs and servants, and we seldom sit by the fire. The night frightens our sleep. Francesco, my son, what have I done? Tell me how it is with you. Knock at the silent door where I wait in an upright chair. They say you're now a leper. Dear one, what has become of you? Your father and I lie abed, stare at the ceiling's wooden beams. Your dog whines mornings. He watches the door. He does not eat. I pat his matted coat. I give you to God, my son. I wait for death. The bells toll under the house. The wind laughs in the leaves. I sit in an upright chair. The line that came to me was, I sit in an upright chair, and I made it, as you can see, a refrain. It kept coming back, and that reinforced the image, and it reinforces the power of the poem, because that is the image I had of her. Another woman now, Saint Clare, who was the first Franciscan woman, and her hair was cut by Francis himself when she entered briefly into a monastery of Benedictine nuns, and then with some sisters who lived at the top of Mount Subasio, and then finally in the little church of San Damiano, she founded her community outside the walls of Assisi, like Francis, outside the walls. And she always considered herself one of the friars, because the friars gathered around and cut her hair, and she was the first Franciscan woman. So I have some poems about her. The first one is, it's a little series of poems. I'll just read a few that are a series. And the first one starts with the moon. The moon is very important in Assisi. Those of you who have been there, you see it so dramatically, night after night over Mount Subasio. And she was a woman of some stature. She was the daughter of a knight. Her mother's family went back to the time of Charlemagne, so they were a very important family. Her mother made the 3 great pilgrimages of that time, with her knights accompanying her to Rome, to the Holy Land, to Mount Gargano in southern Italy, where there was the shrine of St. Michael, the archangel. So, I'll do some Clare poems now that I'll do just as a little series of poems. Her name was Clare di Favarone, because she was the daughter of the knight Favarone. Clare of Favarone, Clare di Favarone. Clare di Favarone and the moon. Full moon over Mount Subasio, high above Father's tower. I love the moon, a burning mirror of light invisible. Or when its crescent, a wry smile before it disappears. Someday, when the moon's a waning sliver of smile, I'll slide down into the veil, dark and close with mystery. Which is what she did literally at one point. She leaves her father's house in the night and dark, goes down through the last gate of the city, the Porta Moiano, and goes out down where the friars were. The second one is called The Rooms of St. Clare. It begins with a quote from Virginia Woolf, one of her books, A Room of One's Own. One has only to go into any room in any street for the whole of that extremely complex force of femininity to fly in one's face. Virginia Woolf. Hers is the mystery of rooms, the room from whose window she watches Francis walk across the Piazza San Rufino, and into whose tapestried forest she withdraws to seek the unicorn's white horn that brings her to that other room where Bishop Guido places the palm into her open soul. Rooms open on rooms. St. Mary of the Angels, the room of vows that opens onto the nuns of Bastia, the lay religious women on Mount Subasio, and San Damiano with its rooms that God has prepared for her, each room conforming to the contours of her soul like a fitted wedding dress. There at San Damiano, she crosses the threshold into the royal chamber. Above the marble altar bed, she sees herself in the mirror that spoke to Francis. She's radiant, calm, pure with desire. She kneels, and the room opens upon mansions of possibility. Other brides cross the threshold with her, fill the rooms of their own espousals. Rooms spill out into streets of their village, a courtyard, around whose well they gather to draw water, talk their own domesticity. They gather for church, like women inside Assisi's walls. They sing psalms, share the bread of life, after which they pass a further threshold into Lady Poverty's dining room, where Clare blesses another bread, crossed with want and penance. But it is the steep ascent from choir through the narrow passageway opening into their bridal chamber that lifts Clare and the poor ladies above routine. For there is the room of redemptive suffering, where Clare ministers to her sick sisters, lies bedridden sewing albs and altar linens. There she opens the door, kneels before her Eucharistic Lord, and prays away the threatening advances of the emperor's mercenary soldiers. There in the room of consummations, she holds her rule that holds all the rooms of the poor ladies' lives. She presses the book of rooms to her heart and crosses the final threshold into all the rooms of her life, now graced with him who is the mirror she enters without effort, without shattering the glass that holds her image inside his. Another image, a larger image of rooms with all the implications and overtones of rooms. A poem itself, if you have 3 lines, you have a 3-line stanza. And in Italian, stanza means room. So if you're writing a poem with a bunch of stanzas, you've got a lot of rooms, and you have to rearrange furniture in there that are called words, and you have to get them right and interconnect the rooms one to another. So that poem has that kind of overtone as well. The next poem, those of you who've been to Assisi, how many of you have been to Assisi? Oh, well, we can just talk then. We got quite a few of you. Well, you know that one of the most precious places there is the dormitory of St. Clare, where she was there with all of these sisters in that room for all those many, many years. So this is called St. Clare in her dormitory. You rise at 3 a.m., sleepless, with spirits good and bad bidding. Your ears ring with silence and nuns asleep in the dormitory, rank with bodies tossing and tired, trying to fit God's dreamed contours. You know it's 3 because the moon fits the slit of window again. As before on sleepless nights, you'd count your prayers till dawn lit the same slit, quiet as angel wings, dark spirits screaming away as bodies turn towards morning's embrace of him who seemed a dream. Your eyes fix on the nails in his hands. Francis dies much earlier than Clare. He dies in 1226. She dies in 1253, so she has many years after Francis died. And she becomes the epitome, the personification of Lady Poverty, clinging to that original dream of the poverty of what Francis and Clare imagined for itinerant life in Francis' case, and in Clare's life for a monastery that was democratized, that didn't have the ladies who were ladies in the world when they came into the monastery. They were ladies there. They sang the songs for choir. They were the ones who were the important people who became administrators, etc. And then their servants were the serving sisters that they brought with them sometimes from the world. But when Clare moves in to San Damiano, it's democratized. All the sisters care for one another. She washes the feet of her sisters. She cares for their wounds. That was a great dream that when Francis dies, somebody who's really attached to you on a project or a person outside of yourselves, that's really a very big thing. When that person dies, a part of you dies because you had that dream together out here. And that's what this poem is about, called The Trees of San Damiano. Those of you who've been there, quite a few of you, know that there's olive trees all the way down the thing. This poem happens to be written in terza rima, the one that Dante used for the whole of the Divine Comedy. But if you notice it, then so much the worse for me. Then it sings sing-songy. But the first and third words of every stanza rhymes, the ending. The first line, the last word, the third line, the last word rhymes all the way through. This is called The Trees of San Damiano. Clare hears of the death of Francis. The same olive trees still grow below the city gate on the hill that slopes to San Damiano. Old, their gnarled fingers twist upward to the sun, like my heart reaching for that sunlit tryst. You and Philip, me and my friend Bona, beneath the silvered leaves that trembled after the hot sirocco's end. I look at the gate we saw was closed to us, and what we talked of, beyond their vision, those who had supposed us outside what prelates would allow, though we were in the poor Christ's body, nailed to the tree that supports me now. The images there are very tight. It's one of those poems that every poem you have to read again and look at it again, because the images are tight and interconnected. One more little poem. I was up in the garden of where we stay in Assisi at Casa Papa Giovanni, and I was looking at the moon, and it was a little crest of a moon, and it looks like a little bark. It was on a cloud, and I all of a sudden thought that Clare's body down in her monastery, where she's buried, Clare's Basilica, was tired and wanted to get out of there and go up and float around a little bit with the moon. So that was the image that I have. It's called St. Clare, Summer Night, Scattered Clouds. It's from a modern book called The Little Flowers of St. Clare. Brother Leo, what do you think I saw reflected on the water down in that well? My Father Francis, said Brother Leo, you would have seen the moon that was shining in the sky. No, Brother Leo, I saw there the face of our sister Clare. End of quote. A crescent moon plays with clouds above St. Clare's Basilica. It slips behind the waves and reappears, unnoticed, where bright floodlights hold her docked tomb, still beneath the lolling clouds. I almost hear water drip from the skiff-like moon floating high above her body's anchored ship. So those are some poems about Francis and Clare. I'm going to read a couple poems about, I'm leaving the Middle Ages and coming to our time. I'm going to read a poem about my father and one about my mother. My father was a hunter and fisherman, and of course, that was my whole life as a little boy, hunting, fishing, and this. And when I came to know Francis, my life started to change, and I left my father just like Francis, not so dramatically, but I left the things he dearly loved, like hunting, and that I loved, because something happened to me. And when my dad died, like a good Franciscan, I kept his guns. I still have most of them, and every once in a while I get the courage to let somebody maybe look at them. No, I have given away a couple of them, but they are so precious because of what they stand for, okay? This one is called Gun Cleaning. I'm sitting on the floor, leaning against Mother's cedar chest, cleaning your guns. I'm trying to remember how, as best I can. I'm using gun oil and old ratty underwear and military lubricant. I'm trying to remember even now so many fathers after you taught me how to do what Father Francis undid. I want to make the barrel shine again, hold the warm light of the oil stock, forget the 270's blue flash that dropped deer and elk, the savage 12 gauges kick into my small shoulder that drilled BBs into quail and cottontail, pheasant and duck. How beautiful these weapons, how graceful the lines, how lethal the fire of exploding powder shooting sleek, hot metal from their round, haloed barrels. Darkness then, and death. Was that what I learned as a boy? then why was there such light standing there beside you, safe in your tough knowledge, your code that tracked wounded game to put them out of their misery, inflicted by the same code that looked like light to the boy, feeling safe beside his father, holding the guns that meant we were or were becoming men. Arthritic, my hand tries to grip the stock, pull the trigger without wincing. Just holding the unloaded gun hurts. I still love the feel of the wood, the dangerous trigger, despite the pain in my hands. But I wince at the images, innocent, panicked eyes, the sudden thump and splatter of blood, the cries, the twitching, the rigid silence. This beautiful object unmans me. Once it made me a man, you said. I put the half-cleaned guns in their proper cases. I shove them under your and mother's bed, where they lie dark and silent and harmless, until I find their cool seduction again and hesitate. Dad, it's you I love, if you're reading these lines. Tell me again, so I understand, how the hunter loves animals, how he's close to the land, how eating is communion with what died at your hand. No psychiatrists in here, are there? The one about my mother is called Sewing Box. Again, like a good Franciscan, when my mother died, I kept the sewing box. Because every time I came home from the seminary, I would reorganize her sewing box. Fussy little kid that I was. So this is called Sewing Box. I have the sewing box and pillowcases you embroidered, having no children to give them to. They comfort and hurt, these flowered calligraphies and the busy sewing box I'd organize on visits home. It's a memory chest, a dream embroiderer, and you, light of foot, hurrying home from drudgery at the elite laundry to mend socks and hearts. Later your step, finical, trying to sidestep pain, your sewing labored, with little left for me to organize. It's a sepulcher whose spools of thread, buttons, thimbles, needles, and pins are stilled, except for this my anniversary fussing with loose threads, drawing them out straight, patting and checking to see what's there, what's possibly not there. These, can it be, almost 30 years of slow erasure? This year I found a hidden drawer not noticed before, a map of home, avenues of nouns and static verbs. Iron Tex, renew a pocket, 25 cents a pair. No sewing, iron on. And the felt needle keeper cutout of a bonneted girl's silhouette I made for you in 4th grade, whose black bonneted head you trimmed in white crocheted frill. The iron text envelope contains the patches, 2 holy cards, prayers to Our Lady, and a pamphlet entitled La Comunione dei Fedeli, which in Italian is the communion of the faithful. I'm Italian, full-blooded Italian, both sides, mom and dad. Okay, can you take 2 more? Okay, some of you look doubtful. I'll try to do 2 more poems. Again, about, this is where the world, where I live, in the inner city in Cincinnati. And I'm very fond of Julian of Norwich, the medieval mystic. And those of you who've read my book, The Mystics, know that I try to show that in the chapter I wrote on her. But she's very important to me, and this poem is called Sunday with Julian. She consoles me as I meditate before Mass, Julian of Norwich, that is, who says, "We are clothed, wrapped in the goodness of God." And she consoles me after Mass when I drive home to the friary and pass 2 prostitutes who are sitting on folding chairs next to the curb, helping each other out with makeup. And that evening, too, when I go to Frisch's for a big boy and fries, and a boy is talking to his girlfriend in the booth next to mine, talking, and his girlfriend's eyes say that she just wants to hold him and quiet him, and he keeps talking, and her eyes keep trying to say, "Let's leave," and when I leave, he's still talking. You know what I'm saying? And she's still trying to subtly persuade him they should leave. And then I'm walking behind a middle-aged man, a son, helping his older mother to the car, and ahead, an older man's walking with his pregnant teenage wife, and she's smiling, and he talks and eats an ice cream cone, and I think the Mass still isn't over. And as I get into the car, Julian's in my thoughts again, and I say to myself, they're all clothed in the goodness of God. And I'm about to drive away when a prostitute, tattooed abundantly, comes to my open window and asks, "Do you have a lighter I could buy from you?" And I say, "No, but I can give you some matches." And she says, "I don't do matches." And I'm wondering, is there a code here I'm not aware of? And she says, "Hey, you're the guy who didn't give me a ride earlier, aren't you?" And of course I was, and didn't, fearing what it might look like, forgetting Julian. And she says, I said to myself, "Okay, I like the jerk anyway," and walks away. And then I drive away, and it's twilight, and I'm left with memories of this day, and I think, clothed or naked, we are wrapped around with the goodness of God. And yes, the Mass begins when it ends. And when I get home, I pick up Julian, and she says, "Mother Jesus leads us into his blessed breast through his open side, and there gives us a glimpse of the Godhead and heavenly joy." Talk about being wrapped in God's goodness. The Mass begins.